Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly fascinating shift in human history. The incredible story of how our ancestors, Homo sapiens, pushed into Eurasia and ultimately replaced the Neanderthals. Now, for decades, we kind of thought we had this whole story figured out. But, as you'll see, some mind-blowing recent breakthroughs are forcing us to completely rethink the narrative. Look at this number. 1. Today, there is exactly one human species left on Earth. And that's us, Homo sapiens. We are so completely used to this reality that it just feels, well, normal. But if you look at the grand scheme of human evolution, being completely alone like this is actually incredibly strange.
Because if we rewind the clock just a little bit, just over 40,000 years ago, the Earth was practically crowded. In Eurasia alone, you had Neanderthals dominating the West, their sister group, the Denisovans, over in the East, and Homo sapiens just starting to push out of Africa. So how on earth did we go from that incredibly diverse, crowded past to our lonely present?
That brings us to Section 1, the single wave myth.
And this brilliantly illustrates what the academic consensus was for a very long time. It was basically a simple story of a single, victorious wave of modern humans sweeping out of Africa, marching straight into Europe, and neatly replacing the Neanderthals. Boom, done. And honestly, when archaeologists looked at the ancient tools, the contrast really backed this up. The Middle Paleolithic era, which belonged to the Neanderthals, featured these basic, sort of shapeless stone flakes. But then the Upper Paleolithic hits, brought by Homo sapiens, and suddenly you have these highly standardized blades and refined projectile points used for missile weapons. It literally looked like an overnight technological revolution brought in by an invading force.
But, reality is rarely that neat. Archaeologists started finding something really weird nestled right between these two distinct eras. They called them transitional assemblages. We're talking about a mosaic of mysterious, advanced stone tools, blades, and even bone body ornaments popping up all across Europe. They didn't quite look Middle Paleolithic, but they weren't fully Upper Paleolithic either. It turned into this massive archaeological cold case that completely baffled experts for decades. I mean, who exactly was making these things?
Well, since scientists were operating under the strict assumption that Homo sapiens simply hadn't arrived in Europe yet, they settled on a rather, let's say, awkward conclusion. The old assumption was that late Neanderthals must have just completely coincidentally managed to invent their own advanced Upper Paleolithic-style tools right before they went extinct. It was definitely a stretch, but without actual fossil evidence to prove otherwise, it was the best guess they had.
Section 2. The Bone Dust Breakthrough. So here's the problem. When archaeologists excavate a cave, they usually just find thousands of tiny, completely unrecognizable, crushed-up animal bone fragments. No perfect skulls or pristine skeletons. To finally solve the cold case of these transitional tools, researchers turned to a cutting-edge forensic technology called zooms. Basically, scientists take a microscopic piece of this bone dust, just dust, and extract whatever surviving collagen is inside. Then, they use enzymes to snip that collagen into smaller fragments called peptides. Finally, they run it through a mass spectrometer to read its protein structure, which identifies the exact species that bone fragment belonged to. It's literally finding a microscopic needle in a haystack of crushed animal bones.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how we can visualize it. Think of a mammal's collagen as the text of a novel. Since collagen is highly conserved across species, most mammals basically share the exact same basic text. But when you use those enzymes to cut it up, it's like finding specific, unique sentences in a shredded novel. By reading those tiny peptide variations, scientists can tell a reindeer from a bison, and most importantly, they can definitively identify a tiny, completely invisible shard of human bone.
Which brings us to Section 3, the failed pioneer waves.
So, using zooms to scan thousands of these tiny fragments from those mysterious transitional tool sites, history was entirely rewritten. Over at Bachokiro Cave in Bulgaria, the technique flagged bone fragments that absolutely belonged to Homo sapiens. But the real bombshell? Radiocarbon dating revealed these modern humans were there, making advanced tools, 45,000 years ago. That is at least 4,000 years before the last Neanderthals actually vanished from Europe. Those transitional tools weren't made by late Neanderthals at all. Homo sapiens were already there.
Let's see how this builds an entirely new timeline, because we aren't looking at a single massive wave anymore. We're looking at a messy reality of scattered pioneer wavelets. Look at this. 48,000 years ago, there's a major genetic integration event near the Middle East. Then, tiny pioneer groups push deep into Europe, arriving in Rallis, Germany 47,000 years ago, and Bachokiro, Bulgaria 45,000 years ago. The final successful overarching wave that actually took over,
didn't happen until the 40,000-year mark.
But here is the absolutely crucial and honestly tragic part about these early explorers. When scientists extracted their ancient DNA, they found huge chunks of recent Neanderthal DNA. This means these pioneers were definitely interbreeding with the local European Neanderthals. But astonishingly, these specific early sapiens left virtually zero genetic descendants in modern Europe. They were a complete genetic dead end. They pushed in, tried to establish a permanent foothold, died out, and were eventually completely replaced by later waves of their own species.
Section 4. Surviving the Deep Freeze. Let's look at what these early humans were actually facing. Thanks to that Zoom's bone dust analysis we talked about, we now know Homo sapiens were living in the cave site of Ranis in Germany, which today sits right under a collapsed castle roof, an astonishing 47,000 years ago. And remember, this wasn't just the sunny southern edge of Europe. This was deep, deep into northern Neanderthal territory.
And I really want to emphasize this number, minus 18 degrees Celsius. By analyzing the environment of that era, scientists discovered that the winter temperatures at Raffskionis hit a freezing minus 18. That is 18 degrees colder than that exact same spot today.
You might be wondering, how do we actually know it was that incredibly cold? Well, scientists looked at oxygen-18 isotopes trapped in the ancient teeth of the horses these humans were hunting. Because a horse tooth grows continuously throughout its life, it basically records summer and winter climate cycles. And the data showed the climate there matched modern-day northern Scandinavia. This totally shatters the old textbook idea that humans only migrated into Europe when the weather got warm and pleasant. No way. These pioneers weren't fair-weather travelers. They were highly capable survivalists, possessing extreme resilience in freezing environments. Section 5. The Final Replacement.
So today, most non-African people carry about 2% Neanderthal DNA individually. And if you add it all up, humanity as a whole carries about 40% of the Neanderthal genome scattered in fragments across our global population. But look at that other slice. A massive 60% of the Neanderthal genome was fiercely, completely scrubbed out of our species by natural selection, mostly because it was harmful or just incompatible with our biology.
And here is how the end of the Neanderthal world actually played out. Fast forward to the 40,000-year mark, and the real wave of Homo sapiens finally takes hold. Unlike those early pioneer wavelets who merged with the locals, this massive final wave completely replaced the local Neanderthals in places like Western Europe. And genetics showed they left absolutely zero local interbreeding traces behind. Complete replacement. So the crucial point is this. Where did our modern Neanderthal DNA actually come from, if not from the Neanderthals living in Europe? It came from a single bottleneck event. Around 48,000 years ago, somewhere near the Middle East, right at the gates of Africa, a specific group of sapiens interbred with Neanderthals. Those specific sapiens then went on to populate the rest of the globe, carrying that 2% signature with them everywhere they went. This completely busts the myth of a continuous European melting pot.
Which leaves us with this final massive stone in the shoe. Our two species didn't just meet in passing, right? Homo sapiens and Neanderthals overlapped in Eurasia for an astonishing 7,000 years. That is a massive stretch of time. Yet, we didn't just merge into one single blended species. Much like certain species of baboons today that live right next to each other but remain entirely distinct, there were boundaries keeping us separate. So I'll leave you with this to ponder. What unseen biological or cultural barriers kept us apart for all those millennia, right up until we ultimately claimed the Earth as our own? Thanks for joining me on The Explainer, and keep questioning the past.